So, hello all. So, we have a panel discussion on the topic Clash of Civilizations, Human Conflict and Globalization. And for this, we have our speakers, Danish and Rodger Baker. So, introducing Danish, he's the author at the Geopolitics magazine, New York. And we have Rodger Baker, who is Stratfor's Senior Vice President for Strategic Analysis at RANE, and myself, Shalini. So I am a public policy and social sciences graduate who has previously worked with the Royal Thai Consulate General, Chennai, as a political and economic assistant analyst. So before we could move in depth with the panel discussion, so it is now almost quarter of a century since Samuel Huntington had come up with his article and a book on Clash of Civilizations. So ever since then, which is the post-Cold War article, and we have many skepticisms and acceptance around this theory. So before that, I would want Danish to speak a bit more about the theory and what it really means for our viewers' understanding.
All right. So after the Cold War ended, the Cold War, of course, was a period when the world was divided essentially into two conflict zones, two ideological blocks based on their economic understanding. Their differing economic outlooks. The Eastern Bloc, which was dominated by and spearheaded by the Soviet Union, and the Western Bloc, spearheaded by the free market capitalists, and of course, the United States being the leader of the Western Bloc. So once the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, what happened was a lot of historians actually came up and said this could be the end of history, and this is the right. We're at the pinnacle of human evolution. We're at the pinnacle of the evolution of the global society. Francis Fukuyama says in his book that this is literally the end of history. But here's this man, Samuel Huntington. He comes along and says, hang on, there's a lot more conflict left, and conflict will evolve and will now happen along a different lines, which is the lines of the civilizations across the world. He identified around 8 to 9 civilizations, the Arab Islamic world, Hindu-Indian civilization, which form the very core of all of these main civilizations of the world. And he suggested that conflict is now going to take shape along these civilizational lines, and nations are essentially going to go back to their ethnic roots. They're going to have a deeper understanding of their ethnic roots, and they're going to have conflicts. They're going to have altercations on multiple levels in the society, as we see today. Samuel Huntington predicted the conflict that we see now panning out between the US and China, the conflict that we see happening in the Arab world, and also the conflict. He to such a great level of precision, he predicted the Russians taking over, annexing Crimea, that actually happened a few years back. So I think he was pretty much spot on there when it comes to trying to explain and trying to spell out the conflict for our times.
Thank you, Danish. So this has almost answered, most of one of key questions as to why is such an epochal event in international relations being considered so significant by the foreign policy researchers and academicians, and why is it that this particular article and book has been so fundamental for most of our understanding of the current world upholding its values of globalization. And also, this precisely, which has been termed as a touchstone for nearly all contemporary discussions, and it questions the capacity of different groups that coexist with, be it in relative amity and not enmity. And apart from that, thank you for briefing us, for our viewers. And so it has indeed, like, broadened our perspective and knowledge about this particular event. So now let's hear out from Rodger. So what his take on this particular theory. So what do you think, Rodger? Like, what is your take on this particular theory? We would like to hear you out.
Yeah, when I look at it, I think that a lot of the work that Huntington did still holds up, and it's a very powerful look at a world that is much more complex than people in the early 90s really were thinking, right? That whole idea of that he brings out of clash of civilizations, continuation of competition is important. But I think that in attempting to create a new unifying theory around civilizations, Huntington misunderstood or misapplied the different levels of nationalism versus these concepts of grand regionalism. So one could argue, well, because he said the Islamic world and the Western world would clash, then 9/11 and the US Muslim conflict was clearly predicted by him. And because he says that the Russians will move back into Orthodox territory, the reclaiming of Crimea is predicted by them. And because China is now competing with the US, then clearly it's Oriental society or Confucian society, as he calls it, versus the West. But you can come up with alternate views that are just as powerful. And if you look at the way in which many states are acting, they do sort of contradict this, right? If you think about Huntington's thesis on Asia, he really does look for cooperation where there absolutely is none. The idea of a hegemonic China doesn't lead to suddenly all traditional Confucian societies falling into the Chinese sphere. In fact, most of those are societies who are neighbors. And by default, when you have the emergence of a hegemon, they start to become defensive and push against them, right? And this is something that we've seen throughout history. So to me, there's a question on the idea that it must be these civilizational clashes. And we see today the emergence in a multipolar system of middle powers clearly denying their civilizational connections and instead aligning with each other. So I think that more traditional geopolitical patterns define the world than these grand civilizations. And Huntington identifies many of these underlying geopolitical structures, and cultures are part of geopolitics. But in attempting to wrap that in a simplifying pattern of there's a Hindu world and a Confucian world and a Western liberal world and a South American world, and by default, those worlds have an affinity. I think that's where the thesis falls down, and we see that play out over the last 25 years.
That's great, Rodger. Like this has also given us the other side of the the theory as to like what take you have, or how do you view this particular theory. This has been indeed a really good perspective or a knowledge that you have added on for this discussion. So now we have a more of an interactive session now, where I would be posing few questions for you and Danish. So over to Danish. So this process of a supposedly like a universal assertion and clash of civilizations has invited support as well as skepticism. And to my understanding, much of it is has been deduced to the degree of acceptance of Huntington's definition of civilization, as how Rodger highlighted, that it's more of a cultural civilizational point of view that he views. And what Huntington has provided us is more on the religious sort of a civilization that he defines within all these countries. And does this mean that his assertions fundamentally question the human nature as something like xenophobic, as how Thomas Hobbes has like highlighted in his very famous literature, The Leviathan? What's your take on this, Danish?
Leviathan talks about essentially a world which is pre-state, or the way he calls it. He of course is one of the three famous social contractists. He calls it the state of nature, and in the state of nature, he supposes that life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, verbatim, and in a way that it actually emphasizes the xenophobic, or not even xenophobic, a very inherent tendency of humans to engage in conflict. Of course, the reason is the fact that we are living in a state of nature, when we are living in times when there is no top authority, state level authority, or a sort of a regularizing force, a regulator, as we have today in most societies. We will sort of reduce. We will be reduced to our Darwinistic, so to say, Darwinistic existence. We would want to have as much share of the resources as we possibly can grab, and therefore that is how he actually calls it the war of all against all. It's a state of anarchy. It's a state of chaos. So it points towards a very grim, a very pessimistic view of the fundamental human tendency towards being xenophobic against others, being being competitive, and therefore it plays out on multiple levels today. I think it plays out on when we talk about civilizations today, or we talk about nation states today, in the context of Samuel Huntington's theory. The same, it actually plays out on much higher levels, on the societal level, on national level, on the global level, because of the fundamental nature. The social world is a clear reflection of our natural world at the end of the day. And I think it is not just, it might be a little pessimistic. In my opinion, I think it is also very realistic, because it takes us back to the very fundamentals of human nature. It takes us back to the very basics of our human tendencies, of our nature as a society, as a national society, as a global society. So I think, yes, pretty much spot on. Xenophobic or conflicting tendencies, if I were to use a milder word, a more moderate word, I think it is one of the most fundamental natures of human beings.
All right. So now over to Rodger. So throughout history, we as human beings have attempted to, understand worldly events and the relations between nations in order to craft foreign policies and predict the future trends. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, around in the 1918, clearly indicated, the rise of globalization, democracy, capitalism, and liberalism. It gave, an identity to all these ideas. They were stemming and they were upcoming in many nations. So do you think have the promises of globalization for a more interconnected world been belied to us, where the same globalization can be a factor for re-injecting religion into international politics? So what's your opinion on this, Rodger?
So I think sometimes we make a misunderstanding of the concept of globalization, and we tie globalization directly to Western liberalism and economics. Globalization is a trend that's been around for a much longer time. I mean, if you go back to reading the writings of Sir Halford Mackinder, he's already talking about a closed world system in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Globalization had already occurred from the 1500s through the 1800s. The entire world was tied together. And by the early 1900s, there was no sort of untouched, unexplored part of the world. And therefore, globalization had happened. I think what we look at the end of the Cold War is this assertion that Western liberal economics and politics are by default universal because they won against the Soviets. And they become both a net draw to people who look at it and say, hey, this is something that will help us become stronger. And sometimes that's through the rejection of religion, like we saw in Turkey. The initially in Turkey, where they try to secularize. And sometimes it's through trying to blend it with religion. But over time, what we've seen is that it's clear that Western liberal ideal is not necessarily universal, despite this assertion that it is. That it really is created in a very narrow geography in the North Atlantic space over a very narrow period of time, based on a particular set of historical philosophies. It emerges as a counterpoint to the emergence of Soviet Russia. And then it becomes part of that ideological battle of the Cold War, to the point where it becomes the very nature of the West, and the assertion is it has to push it on. When you are pushing effectively a revisionist policy on the rest of the world, by nature, then you end up having a return to, as we just talked about, the concept of nativism, or the concept of national self-determination, which is also an interesting European concept that they pushed simultaneously. So you have that pushback. We do see religion reassert itself in certain places. We see culture reassert itself, history reassert itself. It's not always through that religious lens, but sometimes it is. And I would argue often that religious component is more a cultural religion, looking at Israel, looking at what we see through the Middle East, looking at it through India. Often it's more cultural religion than just pure play traditional religion. The same way the Russians are using it to try to revive orthodoxy as a way to tie nation together, increase birth rates, and things of that sort.
Thank you, Rodger. And now, we have the final questions for both of you. Like, I'll just go one by one. So Danish, extending from your previous one, so there's one other major analytical controversy in this regard in today's inter-civilizational tensions and conflicts, which have been typically linked to the perceived polarizing effects of globalization, contrary to different values between the West and the secular Arab nationalists. Do you think this would determine the future course of international politics, Danish?
Well, I think we have already set the theme in a way that the reason that as Thomas Hobbes talks about the pre-state kind of a life, the state of nature, when there is no overbearing authority on top of you, and it's a war against all against all. We are today living in a multipolar world where we do not anymore have the overbearing authority that we used to have a few decades back. After the Cold War ended, US was known as the global policeman. We do not have that anymore. And therefore, we can actually expect all of these we can actually expect all of these societies to be in a constant state of flux with each other, against each other, given the factors of globalization, given the factors of immigration. So I think not just West and the Arab Islamic civilization, and it's not restricted to these two civilizations. It will be restricted. It will be expanded to a lot more other civilizations. What we need to look at would be the touch points. What are the areas of conflicts? For instance, between the West and the Arab civilizations, Arab Islamic value system, what are the points of, what are really the areas of friction? The areas of friction would be something like, liberal individualistic ideas of the Western civilization, Western world, as compared to a more familial or social, tendencies of the Arab Islamic civilization, Arab Islamic world, or the question of rights of women, the question of feminism, for instance. An upcoming conflict that we can actually predict would be along the lines of veganism versus the sacrificial rights in the Muslim culture, sacrifice of animals, that is. So I think these lines of conflict will become even more pronounced as we go ahead with the globalization and immigration giving great amount of headwinds, great amount of tailwinds, I beg your pardon, to these trends. And therefore, I think the theme is set. It is all about finding the lines of conflict. It is all about predicting the areas of conflict based on the kind of value systems that these civilizations have.
Great. Thank you, Danish. So this has indeed, answered most of my questions, that has been posed to you. And the last and, a final question, and then we can wrap this up. So over to Rodger. So, as Huntington's focus also included his concerns about the future of geopolitics in this rapidly, shrinking world, there have been growing instances and dynamic at play, especially with the interaction of technology and social media cultures across the globe. And it is definitely necessary to note the role of privacy culture in the evolution of such technologies, and identifying the roles of such developing and advanced technologies like AI and machine learning. Much of these algorithmic decision making has been applied to the current governance landscapes. And it is already well known that the US and China are heading this race towards artificial intelligence. And what are the possible implications of such techno-cultural pluralism within such countries, Rodger? What is your take on this?
So I think there's two ways to look at that. One is in this question of technology, information sovereignty, personal rights, and things of that sort. And one of the things that we see is that there are clear diversions of the perceptions of the right balance of those in different countries or different regions. The Europeans have a very narrow viewpoint of what should be acceptable for information movement versus freedom of individuals, personal protections and personal privacy. The United States and the Europeans don't exactly match with each other in that. The Chinese are often a very different space, and other parts of the world look at it in different ways. And I think one of the things we're seeing with this is again, this move towards the idea of information sovereignty in different countries. So just as countries have sovereignty over their land, over a certain space of maritime space around them, over certain airspace over them, this idea of digital sovereignty and information sovereignty is starting to expand. And that from the Western perspective is clearly contrary to the ideas of freedom of information and creates a real tension that I think we're going to see play out in the physical space as well. So China's complaints of the rapid expansion of LEO satellites by US companies to create a global internet, right? That's a physical construct that becomes competitive. Competition over the placement of subsea fiber optic cables across the Pacific becomes a physical location for competition and conflict over the concepts of information sovereignty. And then finally, as we look at this, technology has long been a factor that affects the relative balance of power between nations. And the nation that's better able to accelerate and harness the technology is able to dominate over others until others steal it or it becomes ubiquitous. At the same time that we can say technology is lowering the bar for entry for lots of countries, it's still driving this sense of direct military and economic competition, particularly what we're seeing between the United States and China. And that means that we're going to start seeing teasing apart of technology supply chains. And as you do that, other countries are going to be forced to start making decisions. Which technology sphere are they in? Do they find a way to try to bridge between two different technology spheres? Do they run two parallel but isolated sets that increases cost but gives them access to both sides? And I think that as we go down the road, this is going to start having a big impact on the flow of technological information, on trade, on economic development, creating new opportunities, but a lot of new risks for the countries that are caught in the middle as these big powers reposition themselves into much more strategic competition.
Thank you, Rodger. This has indeed, been very knowledgeable to most of us, what has been going on in these spaces, especially, technological spaces, and how can, we can provide a more an academic understanding of what is actually happening. So this has indeed been a very great panel discussion, and thank you for taking your time out for us. And so thank you, Rodger, and thank you, Danish. So I hope this would be a really a great viewing for most of us. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me in the dialogue.
Yeah, thank you.